The rush to the polls has already begun. What can record-setting numbers tell us about this election? The governor's race remains too tight to call as we head into the final days of the campaign, and a battle over polling locations in Dodge City heads to federal court while making international headlines. That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week. Welcome to a special hour-long edition of Kansas Week. Today we're talking about the 2018 general elections, local to national. Starting with the fight in Dodge City over polling locations that's won international headlines. I was there this week as both sides took this case to court.
Anything to say to the public right now?
Ford County election clerk Debbie Cox is at the center of this lawsuit, filed after she moved the only polling location for Dodge City outside the city limits, a mile from the nearest city bus stop. She says due to expected construction at the old site.
That's really what this case is about, is whether or not these burdens that have been established in Dodge City make it too hard for people to vote.
An 18-year-old high school student in Dodge City, Alejandro Rangel Lopez, and other voters say yes. He testified via phone from Dodge City High School, where he's still a student. He described long waits at the polls, difficulties of friends and family finding rides and babysitters, or just getting the time off work to vote. And he described community-wide confusion over locations after a late announcement of the change, followed by nearly 300 voter registration cards mailed out with the old polling site on them.
Anytime you send a notice to voters, some get it, some don't, some read it, some don't. A lot of them don't understand it. But then when you follow up with more notices, more letters, more press releases, it just creates more confusion.
While the overall lawsuit here is about the number of polling locations in Dodge City, this hearing was specifically about what to do on Election Day. Keep the current site at the Expo Center, move it back to the Civic Center, or somehow split the difference.
So I think it is never too late to protect people's fundamental right to vote.
But Cox's attorneys argued it is too late to make any more changes to the polling location. While on the witness stand, Debbie Cox said, quote, "I do not believe it could be practically done." The state's director of elections backed her up, pointing to computer programming and ballot printing requirements that must be met this weekend.
It would be extraordinarily difficult. It would be even more so without violating several state laws.
And we'd like to thank our partners at Cake News for sharing that story with us today. Here to help move our discussion along, we have several guests. Dr. Neil Allen, a regular on our show, political scientist from Wichita State University. Rodney Wren, you've been with us before, a political pundit, former speechwriter for Congressman Pompeo. And Phil Journey, a district court judge and Republican activist here in Sedgwick County. Do I have that not quite accurate?
You know, I used to be in the state Senate, and my political activism's now limited to simply attending events with my wife. But, you know,
but a deep amount
she's
of
still on the
interest
state
and
Central
knowledge.
Committee. But, you know, let's just say I'm a astute observer.
Okay, like I said, a lot. Yeah. Very, very good details for a judge to have.
I can't keep my eyes off the prize, but we'll see.
Well, that's kind of how I ended up in this seat here too. So we may have a few things in common there. But getting on to topic, Dodge City polling. This is not a situation that's new in the sense that they only have a single polling location. That's been for 20 years. But the idea of moving it seems to have sparked this battle over that. Neil, is it just the change, or is it just that it was the straw that broke the camel's back?
Well, also, Dodge City has a large and growing Latino population. And that's a population that will likely be voting more and more in the future as the population becomes citizens and also ages into the electorate. And also that this kind of moving of the polling place will harm that population more because they're less likely to have access to vehicles and also more likely to be not as usual voters. And so I think that's where a lot of the interest is, because if you were going to try to stick within the law but depress the Latino vote in Dodge City, this is how you do it.
And certainly, you talked about the growth there, now up to 60%. They're actually the majority in Dodge City. I found it very interesting as we were sitting in court. One of the questions put to Debbie Cox was, do you understand that the Civic Center is in a white majority neighborhood? And she denied the existence of any sort of housing segregation within Dodge City, and yet we all know that that exists in pretty much every city.
Yeah, I think that the problem here is that they have one polling location. I don't know Dodge City's population off the top of my head.
About 25,000.
Okay, but they could probably use more than one location. And so this is an opportunity. I think Judge Journey can speak to some of the legal intricacies, but I think this is an opportunity for the City Council of Dodge City to say, it's time to have more than one polling location.
Well, honestly, it's the Ford County Commission.
Or
Ford County Commission.
Regardless, they need more than one.
Right, it is very confusing, and a lot of people have flipped those.
Ford County is majority Hispanic. They've had one polling place. From what I've gathered in the news media, they moved it from one that was centrally located to the expo hall. It's a mile and a half out of town, and there's like a sidewalk. But it's mainly because of ADA rules. And the old building just wasn't compliant with that, and that was why the election commissioner moved it. You know, one thing we learn in politics is that we should probably not try to ascribe motives to others. The federal judge Crabtree said for the court to insert itself into this process on the eve of the election by ordering the reopening of the Civic Center, either as the only polling location or a second polling location, likely would create more voter confusion than it might cure. And that's why he denied the relief from the plaintiffs. It's too little, too late. If they wanted this lawsuit to work, you have to understand that if a judge wants to enter an order, he wants to make sure, one, it can be followed, and two, it will work. And I think it was the practicalities that ended up pushing it that way, apparently by his own writing.
And that certainly was the argument that Dodge City made. I do want to make two clarifications. There are two different reasons for why they ended up at the Expo Center. They ended up with just one polling location because of the ADA requirements. Back in 1998 is when they consolidated all of them into one location. They used to have 6 or 7 for Dodge City. And you can tell I've been doing a lot of research on the story this last week or so.
It's been a problem in Sedgwick County too. We've lost a lot of polling places because they weren't ADA compliant.
Yeah, and that is an issue. And they have an entire checklist they have to go through when they go to look at a location to see if it suits as a voting location. But then the reason for moving it from the Civic Center out to the Expo Center was because of expected construction, which actually has not developed. The construction has not yet started. So the Civic Center was completely wide open, which is why that lawsuit went to court asking for that temporary restraining order, because they're like, there's no reason we can't be in the Civic Center right now. Except for 15,000
notices need to be made.
Exactly. Timing and state law, and which is exactly what the judge said.
And I don't know what the state law is, but I don't see how. I'm going to disagree with a federal judge?
Yeah.
If they were to say that have both places open, if you're confused, I mean, unless they would separate out by district, but if they have one and now they have two. Unless you're worried about double voting.
Well, there are statutory requirements that the election commissioner has to fulfill. Like they have to publish who wins the primaries. They have to publish the polling locations. They have to send every voter a card that says this is where you go. And you know, if you change it the Friday before the election, the Thursday before the election, those things can't be done.
Because there are reasons for that. Because you know, imagine what kind of mischief could happen if you allow people to change it right before the election.
Oh yeah.
And then you could have whatever party is organized the best would move knowing they could get their voters. Or also that they would just hire a bunch of buses, then change. And spring that on the other party.
To the city's credit, they've hired a bunch of buses to get people back and forth. I mean, you figure 50 people on a bus, 15,000 voters, that's 300 trips.
But
in one day.
And that was one of the big concerns raised in that court hearing was, the city has a limited number of buses that they're planning to put toward this use, and when those meatpacking plant shifts change and people are going to want to go from the meatpacking plant to the Expo Center to vote, that's hundreds of people that are having to make that trip on limited buses. Yep, and that's what a lot of people are pushing.
But this problem could have been solved or at least mitigated if we actually would reauthorize the pre-clearance parts of the Voting Rights Act and extend it nationwide, because this is the kind of matter that should have been before the courts automatically a year ago. And if it were a southern state or a state under VRA preclearance prior to,
never been under that.
Yeah, but everywhere should be under that, because because the problem of voter suppression is not a regional problem in America anymore. It's a national problem that occurs in lots of different places. And so the Voting Rights Act solved these problems, or at least mitigated them in the South, and it can mitigate them here. Because you're right, going to court a week beforehand is a suboptimal strategy for solving a problem like
That's
this.
such a nice way to describe that.
Well, and even the ACLU admitted that, this isn't our best option, but it's what's available to us now. And that's why they said they wouldn't appeal if they lost their request for this temporary restraining order. To end this topic, this is not the end of this lawsuit. It was one motion out of this lawsuit. Mm-hmm. This lawsuit, I think, is going to be around for a while. But we have other things to talk about. This last week, the top 3 candidates for governor met up for one last debate here in Wichita. But was there a clear winner in this neck-and-neck race? KSN's Craig Andrus took a look.
Chris Kobach, the Republican Secretary of State in Kansas, versus Laura Kelly, a Kansas state senator, versus Greg Orman, the independent businessman, with major polls saying this one is too close to call between Kelly and Kobach, who are in the lead. Some say this debate was anyone's to win or lose.
They were careful in their words, not too attacking, trying not to alienate those undecided voters. 7 days out, who will decide this election.
Analyst Jarman says this was an extremely calculated play by both Kelly and Kobach as they stuck to talking points aimed at their own base of voters. One reason, Jarman says, independent Greg Orman in the mix, a candidate who could swing votes away from one or the other in what remains an extremely close race. So did Orman himself gain ground and votes coming away from the debate? Jarman says maybe.
Orman struggled in the debate to draw clear distinctions. He has arguments, but in the end, lots of the issues came down to a Kobach versus Kelly administration and what they would bring in the future.
So Jarman says it's up to Orman to get out and meet as many people and shake as many hands as he can over the next week. Something both Kobach and Kelly, he says, also sure to do as well.
The good news for all of the candidates is that there was no major gaffe, no major faux pas where all of a sudden someone does not look capable or credible of being the next governor of the state of Kansas. And from that standpoint, I think all 3 candidates would call it a win last night.
And we'd like to thank our news partners at KSN for sharing that story with us. As we look at the governor's race, there has been little to no change since the primary was determined. And what we have seen in the polling numbers, in what we have seen from the candidates, they've all been very good at sticking to their message. How does that impact the ability to get those undecided voters? I'm going to start with Rodney this time.
Well, I think for Laura Kelly, if Laura Kelly wins, it's because she's been able to pull the moderate Republicans. She's been able to get all the former Republican governors and Republican senators and various Republican officials to endorse her. I think if Laura loses, it's because of Greg Orman. Now, Greg Orman's treasurer did resign a couple days ago and did endorse Laura Kelly, but I think that's where they are right now. Kobach's clearly just hoping that the redness of Kansas will maintain him, and the energy will help there. In kind of a backwards way, it's going to be interesting to see. I've coined this reverse coattails. The energy of the James Thompson campaign here in the 4th District, the energy of the Democrat running against Congressman Yoder in the 3rd District. 4 years ago, the Democrats, KDP, had a real problem with voter turnout, even in the 2 big metropolitan areas. So if Thompson has some energy and that 3rd District campaign has energy, I think you could see some reverse coattails helping out Laura Kelly.
Well, and it is, this is unique in modern times, the Democrats actually having decent candidates. And they even have a candidate in the first.
I remember Kathleen Sebelius being pretty good.
Good enough to win votes.
But no, talking about congressional races.
Yeah,
and
right.
so if you look 4 years ago, the Democrats had a solid candidate for governor, and that's about it.
U.S. Attorney, ran against Todd T. Hardy's first time out in '96.
Well, but that's been.
We had Dennis Moore beat incumbent Vince Schallenbarger in the 3rd District in '96.
Right, but it's been quite a while since the Democrats have put up candidates in competitive districts, and so and although I think the 4th really probably isn't a competitive district here in the Wichita area, but Thompson's running a very energetic campaign. He's raised a decent amount and has a massive grassroots effort.
Let's hold our thoughts on the
Sorry.
congressional races. You guys
governor.
are
Let's go
jumping
back to
ahead
governor.
here a little bit. We're trying to talk about the governor's race right now.
Okay. Okay, governor's race. It's not as crazy as Alaska. They just had an incumbent Republican governor suspend his campaign and endorse the Democrat to try to beat the independent. I mean, we're not that crazy here.
No.
But, this is a race. The reason that I believe that the undecideds are so small is because it's been that way from the get-go. People have strong opinions about Chris Kobach. He has very high negatives, and that hasn't changed. That has remained consistent. I think that he's made some significant attempts to try to gain ground in the middle. He hasn't been as successful as Laura at raising money, and if he hadn't had the Bank of Hartman to draw on, I think his campaign, Hartman's given him 2.2 of 3.2 raised for his entire campaign, 2/3 of his expense. When Laura Kelly's raised over $1.5 million, of her own efforts. So I think that Laura Kelly and the congressional candidates in the 2nd and 3rd district have sucked all the air out of the room for the Democrats. So, and that's showing down ballot too. I don't think we're going to know who's governor until Thanksgiving. I think it's going to be just like the primary, and we're going to go to the contested ballots. And, it's just too close. Every poll, it's always within the margin of error. And it's anybody's race to win and anybody's race to lose.
Well, I'm glad you brought up polls, because I want to talk about polls here for a little bit. As we've said, this remains an essentially tied race, with 2 new polls this last week confirming that tie, although showing signs of maybe some possible movement.
2 new polls have been released in the last week of the governor's race. One, part of the Docking Institute's biannual Kansas Speaks survey. It showed Democrat Laura Kelly with a 4-point lead over Republican Chris Kobach. That lead may not be quite as big as it looks once you account for the margin of error and, as analysts point out, the policy and issue questions that preceded the governor's race on the survey. According to the Garden City Telegram, a poll by Ipsos in partnership with Reuters and the University of Virginia Center for Politics put Kelly at 43% and Kobach at 41%. As the 2 candidates vie for dominance in this race, both are trotting out their endorsements. Kobach with visits from President Donald Trump and Vice President Mike Pence and support of the Kansas Firefighters Union, while Laura Kelly points to support from Kansas police, as well as all living former Kansas governors except Sam Brownback, both Democrat and Republican. She also got a surprise endorsement this last week from Greg Orman's treasurer. According to the Wichita Eagle, Tim Owens, a former Republican state senator, resigned his position with the Orman campaign on Tuesday to announce he was endorsing Kelly. His statement said the move was an effort to stop Chris Kobach from winning in November.
And it really does seem to be, to me, at least from what I've heard, that the theme of the Kelly campaign is stop Kobach. He's another Brownback. I mean, talking about sticking to the theme, that's what I have heard in every debate I have been at.
Right, and
I brought all the postcards from my house. It's just like in the mail every day. It's like I get a new present. There's no plagiarism in politics, so I always keep all these things.
Well, and actually, the depth of unpopularity of Sam Brownback really cannot be overestimated. And frankly, Kobach is probably more popular than Brownback, and also his nativist agenda actually gives him something else to talk about besides defending, the Brownback tax cuts and cuts in school spending. Because if it's about school spending and the results of Brownback's tax cuts, then Laura Kelly wins.
Okay, so here's a question for you. What is hurting Kobach worse, his negatives that you talked about, Phil, or Sam Brownback?
I think they're part one and the same. Everybody talks about Brownback's tax plan. It wasn't his tax plan. It was the state Senate's tax plan. They took Brownback's plan and Christmas treed it up and thought he'd veto it, and he said, "Be careful what you wish for," and he signed it. Mm-hmm. So, it was the legislature's plan, not Brownback's. But the fact is that we had to live with it. And the fact is that some want to starve the vine by cutting off the roots. That's pretty obvious too when it comes to issues about spending. What Kobach says is reduce taxes, reduce spending, smaller government, individual liberty. He's trying to stick to the 4 principles of Ronald Reagan. Laura Kelly is like, let's be a manager here and try to accommodate the Supreme Court. There's this huge education fight that's been going on for the last 4 decades. And
more than just
this is about, this whole election is in some part about that. So I think that it's easy to oversimplify voters' decision making in these very complex issues. And they voters really try to understand these things, and I don't think people give them enough credit. I really don't. So, what do they want? Do they want a fight? Do they want a manager? We'll see.
No.
I think it's all about turnout. It's all about turnout. Whoever turns out their side more effectively, they're going to win this race.
I was going to ask, is it about what voters believe, or is it going to be more a case of party loyalty? I've talked about before how with candidate Kobach on his Twitter account, from the day that he was named the nominee, has had hashtag Remain Red, very much pushing that party loyalty aspect. How many of those Republicans that Kelly needs in order to win are going to reach the ballot box and decide, I really can't vote Democrat?
Well, and Kobach is not going to run a campaign that reaches out to Democrats. But in Kansas, you don't need to.
He doesn't have to.
and although previous Kansas governors have done that, I mean, all the previous Republican governors that have endorsed Laura Kelly are ones that govern a little bit differently. But Kobach has a past. He has a very clear and articulate vision for Kansas. And also, you can win an election with 45%, particularly whenever the opposition is divided. And if you look at Orman, he's running against parties, but his issue positions are basically identical with the Democrats. I mean, if anything, he's tried to get left of Kelly on various issues, particularly on guns. And so, usually what happens is third-party candidates or independent candidates run worse on election day than they poll. And so my guess is that he's going to be in the mid-single digits, and that probably means a 2 or 3 point Kelly victory.
Okay. Well, we have 2 different predictions. We'll have to see what happens on Election Day.
All I'm saying is we'll know by Thanksgiving.
But we have now caught up with where you guys wanted to jump ahead to. We need to turn to the races for Congress here in Kansas. In the 4th District, it's a rematch between incumbent Republican Ron Estes and Democratic challenger James Thompson. The Wichita Eagle is calling the race a surrogate campaign for the Donald Trump-Bernie Sanders battle that never was.
Democrat James Thompson was the surprise candidate in 2016 who nearly toppled Republican dominance of the Kansas 4th District seat in the U.S. House. He never stopped campaigning and has proved a tough challenger for the now incumbent Republican Ron Estes. The Wichita Eagle says Estes has pinned his campaign to the president's record in office over the last 2 years, while Thompson has aligned himself with Sanders. One of the biggest differences between the 2 candidates is on taxes. Estes believes the tax cuts under Donald Trump have helped the Kansas economy, saying in a KPTS-sponsored debate they're expected to grow the economy nationwide by $6 billion the next 10 years. In that same debate, Thompson likened the tax cuts to the tax policies of former Kansas Governor Sam Brownback, saying they'll destroy the national economy just like Brownback destroyed the economy here.
Okay, so there that name is again, Brownback. And I know hearing from party leadership on both sides, even 3-4 years ago, concerns about the Brownback effect changing outcomes in this election. How big of an effect does that have for a congressional election? Neil?
Well, there's been actually some research that showed that in 2014, even considering the low quality of Democratic candidates for the U.S. House, they ran a little bit worse than they should have, even though they all lost by a lot. And we're in a different environment now where it looks like the Democrats will almost certainly pick up the 3rd. I'd probably say they're a slight favorite in the 2nd, and will run much better than they have in a general election in a long time here in the 4th. But in defense, though, maybe not defensive as this position, but also the Brownback tax cuts had certain negative consequences here in Kansas because we have to balance our budget. And so then you have to find that money somewhere, and since half of our state budget is for schools, for K-12 schools, then you have cuts there. But on the national level, we have had many gigantic tax cuts in the past and gigantic spending increases. But on the federal level, since we don't have to balance our budget, though if there's negative effects, they don't come as heavy and as quick as the effects of the 2012 and 13 tax cuts came to Kansas.
Well, and that's the kicker. I mean, the federal government can borrow money from China and Japan and Great Britain and us and American citizens. Anybody can loan the government money by purchasing T-bills. Yeah, well, there's that too. But that's the big difference. But Thompson's going to do, I kind of agree but disagree. Sometimes I think that, voters get the nuances, but sometimes I think that they're just the party loyalists don't care. But going back to something you said earlier, I think is going to be really interesting, and I know there's no way to ever know this, but to see how many people, the old way, but zigzag between voting Republican, voting Democrat, voting Republican, voting Democrat as they go down the line, because you have people, how many people are going to go straight ballot versus, when are they going to cross that party line? That would be interesting to see, and I don't know if that information could be gotten.
But you could get a lot of split party voters in voting for the Republican for governor or Orman for governor, and then voting for Thompson for Congress, and Thompson would still lose.
Right.
Because this is a district that's tough for a Democrat, and especially if the Republican base turns out and they're activated, which in the special election they weren't.
Right.
Yeah. All right.
I'm trying. I'm trying. Okay. All right. Look, you can look at Charlie Cook. You can look at Real Clear Politics. Nothing has said that the 4th District is competitive.
Right.
It leans red. It's not a question. I mean, it's not as red as the first. It's not as red as the 1st District, because I bet Law Police doesn't get 25%. But the real congressional races are in the 2nd and the 3rd districts in Kansas.
And I'm going to stop you right there.
And we're going down to 3 districts in 2 years, 4 years.
Yeah.
We're going down to 3.
No, we won't.
We'll see.
Well, that's an argument for a different day. Right now, though, let's turn to the congressional races in eastern Kansas that, as has already been mentioned, could turn blue this year. In both races, the Republican candidates, one an incumbent, are struggling. In the 3rd district, basically the Kansas City area, Representative Kevin Yoder has struggled in the race for months, leading to national backers pulling their funding. Yoder faced off with Democrat Sharice Davids for their first and only debate this week. The Kansas City Star says he made several misleading and inaccurate statements during that debate, while Davids failed to lay out clear policy plans, using her time to tie Yoder to Donald Trump. Groups that rank political races like Sabato's Crystal Ball say this race is leaning Democrat. A New York Times poll this month has Davids with a 48 to 39% lead over Yoder. In the 2nd district, basically the rest of eastern Kansas, the New York Times polling gives well-known Kansas Democrat Paul Davis a slight lead over Republican newcomer Steve Watkins. This comes as the Topeka Capital-Journal reports an Alaska woman says Watkins made unwanted sexual advances on her a decade ago. Watkins and the state Republican Party tell the Kansas City Star this is another example of Brett Kavanaugh-style destruction politics. Watkins has already had to fend off accusations he lied in his online campaign biography about racing in the Iditarod and scaling Mount Everest in the same year and building a company in the Middle East from scratch. And for those of you who have joined us, we are again doing a special hour-long show, so don't go away. We're not done. We have plenty to talk about yet. And talking about Watkins, we've got plenty to talk about just right there. I don't know that I can remember a time in the last few years covering politics that I've seen a candidate shoot himself in the foot quite so many times. I know you were kind of, Phil, having some moments there as we were watching that piece.
Okay, I'll tell you what, about Mr. Watkins. His daddy created a super PAC and funded his primary campaign, $500,000. I don't see any public support for him. I don't see him raising money. I don't see him having a draw from the voter base. Paul Davis won that congressional district when he ran for governor against Brownback. The Capital-Journal called him on puffing his personal resume. He did an interview that was so bad that it just boggled my mind, watching him try to struggle answering questions like, what do you want to tell the voters about yourself? It's been amateurish at best, and if he gets away from his handlers, he's got to have a really short leash. So I really think that one's a fait accompli. I also think the 3rd district is too. when the challenger refuses to debate the incumbent, that says a lot about the race. And they've both done, they've just done an outstanding job raising money. They've sucked all the air out of the room, like I said before. And I think Kansas is going to end up with a split congressional district. That one, the second district's within the margin of polling. The third district is well outside it. No. And I'll tell you, the funniest thing I saw getting ready for this show was everybody needs to go to the Kansas City Star's website and watch the panels of 10-year-olds looking at campaign ads. It is the funniest thing. It was just great. I found that today. I just couldn't stop watching it.
But if you look at the second, though, why Watkins probably still has a chance is because
it's such a heavily Republican
district. It is, and also we often think of it as Topeka and Lawrence, and there's a significant population
it goes
there.
All the way down to
but there's a lot more. And also, if you look at when Davis won that district, by not a huge margin, but a huge margin, but a significant margin when he ran for governor, it's because he won the vote in Crawford County, which is Pittsburgh, and did okay around Pittsburgh. But that vote dropped off a cliff for the Democrats in 2016, and it might be that Democrats are never going to get back down there, and that can make it close, even with big turnout in Topeka and Lawrence. I think Davis is still the favorite.
It leans blue when you look at Cook or when you look at RCP.
Yeah, well, and that's and although if there's a nationwide polling error of a couple of points, then Watkins could get close. Although if the Republicans nationally weren't so stretched in so many places, you could drop $10 million and talk about how Paul Davis is a lefty liberal from Lawrence, because he is.
He is, and he's a lawyer too.
And you might be able to beat him there. But the Republicans nationally have got so many more places to drop that $10 million.
They cut off Kevin Yoder. Mm-hmm. They cut off other candidates because they're going through triage right now.
Yeah, I find it interesting. They cut off Yoder and not Watkins, despite all of his missteps. So that's going to be an interesting race to watch on election night.
They think they can save that one.
And as so goes Kansas, I think so goes the nation. If Democrats pick up Yoder's seat and certainly the second district, I think you have the U.S. House. Nancy Pelosi is the next Speaker of the House.
Right. Most likely, although Kansas, there is a Brownback penalty that's dragging the Republicans down.
Sure.
So, in talking about the Brownback penalty and Kansas, we're going to bring things back to the Kansas House. The entire Kansas House is up for re-election this November, and any changes could impact legislation over the next 2 years, especially when we're talking about school funding. The Wichita Eagle reports school funding is at the top of the list of issues Wichita area House candidates are hearing about from concerned Kansans. After a wave of moderate Republicans took office in 2016, school funding changes passed by the minimum 63 votes needed. Several moderate Republicans then lost in the primaries this summer. Whoever ends up in the House this fall will be part of efforts to find more money for schools as ordered by the state Supreme Court, and likely efforts to change the Kansas Constitution. The Docking Institute's biannual Kansas Speak survey shows just 11% of Kansans favor cutting K-12 education spending, and many are worried about increasing teacher shortages. And both of those are stories I've done ad nauseum over the last few years. But as we look at the Kansas House, we were talking before the show started, Phil, that you're looking at the numbers and a good number of those races are already decided.
37 Republicans and 23 Democrats have already been elected. They have no opposition in the general election. One Republican, Steve Becker, is running a write-in campaign because he lost his primary by 9 votes. I'd rather lose by 9,000 than 9-2, but excuse me. It's pretty obvious that the conservatives have taken the House back. And so I think that trend will continue in the general election, and that's going to set up for some really interesting dynamics come January 10th or so, when we see how that goes.
Well, conservatives taking the House back, but we've still got a lot more contested races than we usually have.
We got
for
65.
The Kansas House.
Well, but I'm not sure if that's quite right about the conservatives taking the House back. I mean, they have reversed some of their losses from 2 years ago.
The majority of the caucus.
Well, that might be true.
And that determines the speaker and the leadership.
Right, but also that doesn't mean they have a working majority, because if the moderates are 40% of
yeah, they control the committee chairmanships, they control the vice chairmans, they control the conference committees.
But as we saw in the last 2 years, you don't have to control the agenda to control the outcome.
What?
It was the moderates and the Democrats that got together.
No, but it really helps.
No, it certainly does. But also, though, the kind of work that the legislature is going to need to do is going to be a little different because it depends on who the governor is.
That's going to depend on who the governor is. You're exactly right.
But also, though, in the state house, depending on what the Democrats do, whether they pick up 0 or 2 or 6, but it's not going to be a large number. But we're still going to have a house that's probably going to be a little more conservative than the last one. But
don't forget, we're going to have 2 new state senators too.
But also, the Senate's probably not going to have a working majority for anything. And but we're still not going to be back where we were in 2010 and 12, where in the state house there was a clear working conservative majority. In the state Senate there was a clear working majority after the 12 elections. And you're right that's where the tax cuts came from. It was, the legislature was for it. I mean, Brownback is a name people know, but it's about the legislatures elected in 10 and 12 and there was a backlash against that.
I think Susan Wager will have 27 votes on a lot of questions.
I think she's going to have to work a lot harder for those 27 votes than she's had to for the last few years.
The person that's going to replace Vicki Schmidt, because she's pretty much going to win insurance commissioner, is going to be much to the right of her. And then I think the Republican that is going to replace Jake LaTurner, who's going to be state treasurer again, since he got appointed, is going to be to the same family that he was. So, when you look at the intricacies of the House and how these legislative bodies work, conservatives will control the Republican caucus, and that means they control the leadership and the committee positions, and that means they control the agenda. Yes, a coalition, but can they get to 63 after November 6th? I don't know. It will be close. I mean, how many votes in this last session were 61, 62, 63? Mm-hmm. And, and the mods lost 14 seats. So I don't know if it's no longer going to be a 3-party dance, that it was before. So we'll see. But 14 is an iceberg to try to get your ship around.
And I think that's where the Laura Kelly campaign needs to be really going after voters to try to A, get some coattails, but B, say, unless you want another Brownback, unless you want a Kobach and conservative brotherhood between the Capitol building, well, the governor's office is in the Capitol building too, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's all in the Capitol building.
Different floor though.
It's a different floor. So unless you want another, fairly far right legislature and governor, you've got to vote for something different.
Although if we do have a Governor Kobach, then the question is there's going to be several state senators who are Republicans, particularly who have a lot of rural constituents, that are going to have to face up to the consequences for public schools and their communities if we go back to where we were in 2012 and 13. And at that point, that looked like a winning agenda.
That's a lot of dots to
Not to
connect.
mention talking about those Western Kansas legislators also facing the consequences of Kobach's immigration designs.
That's why Farm Bureau wouldn't endorse him.
Yeah.
Because they need 70,000 people to help them in the fields. You can't get somebody from Wichita to go out there and make $10 an hour. They won't go out there on the kill floor for $25 an hour.
No, I wouldn't. Of course.
It's a good living out there in Ford County.
Yeah. And a lot of people are willing to do it, just not from eastern Kansas.
Right.
All right, so we've got some other races to look at as well. 2 of the 3 races for Sedgwick County Commissioner are being overshadowed by fights over hiring and management practices in Sedgwick County and an FBI investigation. This report I filed with Cake News gives us an idea of what's going on.
It's all connected, gentlemen, and we all know it.
The fighting on the Sedgwick County Commission started Tuesday morning after Chairman David Dennis surprised his fellow commissioners with an off-agenda proposal. He wanted to change the board's operating rules for executive sessions to match state law, lowering the required number of commissioners from 4 to 3.
Let's say, hypothetically speaking, you had 2 commissioners who were the targets of an ongoing FBI investigation. They could then control what happens.
Despite objections from 2 commissioners,
This is a farce, and you know it.
the proposed change passed by a vote of 3 to 2. Soon, commissioners were arguing again over whether to go into executive session, closed to the public, to discuss personnel issues.
It is no secret that this investigation is looking into matters which are the subject of this proposed executive session. And I believe this is likely an attempt to cover up possible illegal conduct of Commissioners O'Donnell, Unruh, and Dennis.
A lot of accusations were thrown around, and I just want to make sure that everyone knows that my concerns with the personnel issue, and I'm not going to say who it is that we're discussing because we're not supposed to talk about personnel issues out of here, have nothing to do with the FBI investigation and go back well over a year, 2 years ago.
Commissioners Jim Howell and Richard Ranza boycotted the executive session, remaining in the boardroom instead.
I'm concerned that it seems to me that two commissioners could discuss something and then potentially conduct business with three commissioners. That to me just seems like a Kansas Open Meetings Act concern, as we know.
Now, both Ranza and Howell are up for re-election. I spoke with Ranza's opponent, Democrat Lacee Cruz, about all of this to ask her what she thinks. And when we spoke, one of the things that she talked about was the need to make sure that Sedgwick County employees know that they are supported and have a good place to work, and that is obviously not happening right now.
You know, in times past, we've had people flock to the county to work, and now people are flocking away from the county. So I think there should be an investigation. I'll put it to you like this. When you know the answer to the question, you don't want to ask the question. I feel like they know what's going on. They don't want it to come out because of the election or whatever the case may be. I think that they don't want these things to come to light, and that's why they are blocking it.
Now, some very good questions there from both sides. Certainly, as a journalist, I am in full support of transparency and higher quorums, knowing that just 3 people off of the commission can go into executive session. I don't know, that just seems a little odd. We were talking a little bit about the history of that, but talk to us a little bit, Rodney, I'll start with you, about the importance of quorums.
I think it's the importance of having discussions and debates and having adult conversations and working for the best interests of your constituency or constituencies. And when you start shrinking the number of people to create a quorum, you're coalescing power. And we were joking before the show about how it's generally been 3-2 on the county commission. How that makeup has changed is kind of interesting now. But I think it's a problem that 3 county commissioners can conduct business in executive session, and then you basically then can have 2 that get to decide policy or personnel issues. I think that's a problem.
Although it's only a majority of 2 if the other 2 don't go into session with them.
Sure.
So that and also there are lots of issues that happen whenever you have one of your 5 voting members is under indictment, and when especially if that investigation then goes to the work that he's doing or is being done on his behalf in the county commission, then that requires lots of work by lawyers. And at this point, there's a question as to whether one of the county's lawyers disclosed privileged attorney-client information to the FBI. But this is, frankly, a mess. And one that...
That's such a nice way to describe it.
I mean,
I like the word kerfuffle.
I'll tell you what. I remember Bud Hanson and Dave Bayouth, and I was always on good terms with both of them. I know all of these county commissioners personally. It is a difficult thing, and this indictment has certainly complicated things significantly. We will not know until there's a trial. We will not know until there's evidence presented and a jury verdict.
Yeah.
So,
and that's an issue when we've got elections coming up.
Well, Mike O'Donnell's not running for re-election at this time. He's not up for 2 years, and believe me, the sharks are circling, and people are already saying, pick me, I'd love to be a county commissioner. So, I ran for county commission in 2000, and, and I'm still on great terms with Mr. Norton. He and I are still great friends, just like I'm still friends with the first guy I ran against for state senate, Jim Francisco. So, it's all about how we do things. It's not, and what we choose to do. Mm-hmm. And, some of these things that we see going on in the county commission, it has gotten down to a very personal level when real policymakers need to stay above that.
Agreed. Mm-hmm. And one last question very quickly. As we look at this and we look at the actions that Ranza and Howell, the 2 that are up for re-election, are taking, how much of what's going on is about what's happening on the commission and how much of it is about the fact that they're in re-election races?
Well, I think it's more about the commission and the fact that they're in the minority and they're worried that the majority will use various kinds of processes to go around them. Because if they're trying to get reelected by this, I think that's a poor way to do it. But I think that Howell is solid because he's in a Republican district, and Ranzau's in trouble because he's in a leaning Republican district in a bad year for Republicans, and he's got a decent candidate running against him.
And he barely survived the primary.
Howell only has an independent running against him who hasn't run much of a campaign, Mr. Skelton, who was a Republican, is now not,
in fact,
and was a former commissioner and got beat, and, so that one's really not a race. And neither's Ranzau either. The real race with Ranzau was in the primary, and that was mounted by business interests because they didn't like the way Ranzau fly-spec what they wanted.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And they really didn't like that, and so both those races are pretty much already decided.
And I think this helps someone like Richard Ranzau. I think him sticking to his guns and his principles, I think his constituents and his voting bloc in that district like what he does and his philosophy. And so him sticking to his guns on something like this, I think helps him during this election.
All right. Well, something that helps a lot of candidates during these elections are ads, and we're seeing a lot of them lately. As the end of the election season approaches, you've probably noticed all those campaign ads increasing. KSN's Craig Andrus shows us from candidates to political action committees, they're spending millions to win your vote.
The political ads are going strong, and it doesn't come cheap. And political action committees are adding to what you see, with spending this year on congressional candidates alone at $2.5 million and counting.
Everyone says that they hate getting the mailers and everyone hates getting the phone calls, but there is a reality that it keeps the candidates and the campaigns in the public mind.
While candidates also spend millions combined, they do not coordinate with PACs because that is not allowed. Still, political experts say PACs are pretty plugged into the messaging of campaigns, and they are spending money for you to see on social media and on TV.
Those PACs dwarf the amounts that are given to candidates.
And while significant amounts of money have been spent in the primaries, some of the spending by PACs ramps up to larger amounts in the general election.
In races that are close, and when the total amount being spent gets higher and higher, the cumulative effect of all of that advertising and all of that publicity does make a difference for candidates.
Jeff Jarman says the governor's race is close by most all polls out now, so you can expect a lot more of the PAC money and local money as well, spent by candidates right up to and including Election Day.
That does play a role in turning out the vote and who wins elections.
Okay, and for this round, Phil, I'm going straight to you because you brought us show and tell today.
These are all the cards I'm getting at my house, yes. There were quite a few. I think there's a marginal return. There is a diminishing marginal return. I think economics is a great analogy for these ads. People just get overwhelmed, and then they just stop having the effect. It's important to remember that campaigns, when they purchase their ads, they get the lowest possible rate. When the super PAC comes in and spends money, they're paying market rate. They're paying market rate, so they're spending somewhere between 3 and 10 times as much as the candidate for this very same 30-second spot. And that shows you how much money's coming into Kansas and how important our races are nationally, because it's just burying us. Yeah.
I would argue that this year, given the number of contested races, the national interest, international interest, that we're probably seeing more money come in this year than we normally do in Kansas.
Well, it's certainly on the congressional level, because you have in the second and the third, you have fully funded campaigns, although the Republican hasn't raised very well in the second, but there's been a lot of national money. Here in the fourth, Thompson has raised over $1 million and has run ads, although his campaign seems to be more focused on grassroots mobilization. Mm-hmm. And sure, there's lots of ads, and also there's tons of ads for the governor's race, and not just from the campaigns, but from allied super PACs. I mean, if you can't watch, the World Series without seeing, pictures of Kobach and Brownback together, and pictures of Laura Kelly and Nancy Pelosi and Barack Obama together, and even though none of these people are on the ballot except for Kobach and Kelly. But also, though, they do give voters information. It tells voters, that Laura Kelly, she is a Democrat, and she will pull our public policy in a leftward direction. Chris Kobach will pull it in a rightward direction.
No.
I think the problem is the darkness behind where the money comes from. And I'll just give you one example. The Kansas Values Institute, like, who are they? Where are they getting their money from? I see ads from them, especially all over Facebook. And that's an unintended consequence of the McCain-Feingold campaign finance reform from clear back in 2001 or 2002, whatever it was, is that you can have now these PACs and these super PACs who don't have to disclose their money, whereas the candidates obviously had those campaign contribution filings that they have to report. So if you want to know who's giving money to Chris Kobach, which is mostly Wink Hartman, then you can go find that out. If you want to know who's giving Laura Callion money, you can go find that out. But you don't have to know. You can't know in a lot of these ways. Who's giving money to these super PACs because of the way the law is written.
But the super PACs exist because the Supreme Court struck down parts of the McCain-Feingold, and within the Citizens United case, and also even more important one called Speech Now that came out of the appeals court, and basically says that, you know, if you're an individual person, you have the right to spend money. Now, your rights might be a little channeled if you're trying to give money to a candidate. If I want to give money to the Kobach campaign, am limited. Wink Hartman, since he's part of the Kobach campaign, is not limited, and so thus there's, 60% of Kobach's money.
Well, he loaned the campaign the money.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's not new. I mean, we saw the same thing from Collier to Brownback.
Yeah, right.
So.
Yeah, but Collier got paid back.
Although the Collier-Brownback campaign, or the Brownback-Collier campaign, seemed to think that they would look like a functioning campaign or a better campaign if Collier would loan them money right before the filing date.
And then he got it back.
And then, but the larger problem is the idea that you can't find out who's backing these groups.
Well, a lot of these are 501c4s, and so they're not advocating, electing, or not electing someone.
Right.
They're just issue-oriented, and they're educating the public.
Yeah,
That's how they work.
Sure.
And yet, unlike candidates, they don't have the same impetus to try to stick somewhat close to the facts.
Well, and one of the problems is I think this exacerbates the cynicism people have about politicians, because it is not reasonable for a voter sitting at home seeing an ad on television to sort out the fact that the Laura Kelly campaign is entirely different from the Kansans for Good Values and Happy Unicorns campaign that is running running ads that they may be different, and one may be more negative than the other, but they're just pushing the same message. And if the Kansans for Baby Unicorns campaign wants to run ads saying incorrect and wrong things about Chris Kobach, there's nothing the Laura Kelly campaign can do about it.
Yeah.
And so it's bad for democracy, because people think that politicians and elected officials are way more cynical and evil than they really are.
All right, and we're going to have to leave that there, because some people have actually already made their decisions and hit the polls. Many of you have decided who to vote for, and you're doing it in record numbers, as Cake's Greg Miller shows us.
The stream of people in and out of the Old County Courthouse is a scene we will see in a lot of other places soon, as early voting expands tomorrow and turnout remains high.
We have had a significant increase in registered voters over the last few years.
15 more polling places will open in Sedgwick County. They'll only be open a few of the next 7 days and at select hours, which is why the county elections clerk continues to push for making a plan to spend your time at the ballot box.
Pick your day that you're going to vote. If you're going to vote early, know what location you want to go to. Make sure it's open during the times you want to go. Download your sample ballot. Do your research so when you walk in there, you know who you want to vote for.
The high turnout is not slowing down. The Secretary of State's office says so far, about 50,000 more ballots have been mailed out this year than the last midterm in 2014.
Early voting might be up in Kansas because the governor's race is driving most people's thoughts about politics. And there's not many people that are undecided about Chris Kobach or Laura Kelly.
But political experts say predicting turnout is tough, and predicting who they're voting for is even tougher.
But this year there's a lot of unpredictability. So if you're concerned about standing in long lines, you should probably vote early.
Well, and another aspect of the voting early is a lot of the campaigns are really pushing early voting. Get in there, get that vote locked in. You've worked with a campaign, Rodney. Can you give us a little bit of a perspective on why campaigns and candidates really want you to vote as soon as you can?
Well, that way that we don't go till Thanksgiving to know who the winner is. The more people vote early, the less crunching has to be done on election night. And the less work you have to do on election day for voter turnout. But I'm old-fashioned. I like voting on election day and getting. I know people should vote early and vote often. Just kidding. But
Only in Chicago.
Only in Chicago.
Yeah.
But the campaigns want people to get out and vote early, and they push their supporters to get out and get early, because that just means it's kind of like, okay, they're done. We move on. We try to get another segment. But that's why they're doing it.
And what's the impact of early voting?
It has changed the way campaigns operate. And too many campaigns I see, a bunch of pikers still run the old way. The truth is, the campaign has to be like a wave, and you peak at the primary, and you come up, and then you need to peak about the middle of October, and sustain that effort all the way through the election time. I've worked in 100 campaigns, and it has fundamentally changed how we do it. And the reason campaigns try to get you to vote absentee or vote in advance is so they've got less people to track down on election day to try to get them to show up. And the truth is that if you get it done early, one, whatever happens after you vote doesn't affect your vote. It's already done. And so it stops, it blunts October surprises. The other reason is that nobody wants to stand in line on election day, and it's going to be a long line this election day. I'm going to vote just as soon as we get done here. My wife, I'm trying to get my kid to come back to Wichita on Saturday, because she's got to work. She works at doctor's office. And, I'm going get this done, because you don't want to be there Tuesday. It's going to be busy, and these new machines are slow.
Yeah. So back to you, Neil. What's your prediction for this election based on the early turnout we're already seeing?
Well, actually, I would say that to leave aside early voting, because you can never really tell whether, the Democrats seem to be doing well in early voting, but maybe they're just doing well at moving their voters to vote early. And so if I had to guess, I think Kelly's going to win by a nose. The Democrats are going to pick up the second and the third. Thompson will break 40, but that's about it. And the Democrats will pick up maybe 2 or 3 seats in the State House.
All right. Well, we're running out of time, gentlemen. It always seems to happen. I really appreciate you joining me. I've enjoyed the perspective you've added as we've had this discussion. If you have any questions after the show, feel free to reach out to us on Facebook and Twitter, or email us at kansasweek@kpts.org. For now, have a great week, and if you haven't already, go vote.